Hi, I'm Susan Shaner with Community Forum, and I'm your host tonight. And I have the great pleasure to have with me Steve Dahlberg, who is the director for the International Center for Creativity and Imagination. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you. That's a lofty title, so tell us what exactly that means.
Well, it's an organization that I run that works with pretty much almost anybody, because given the nature of creativity and creative thinking, it's a topic that anybody can apply to think differently about whatever it is they do. So whether it's in education and bringing creativity into the classroom and in teaching, or in a corporate setting to problem solve differently or come up with new ideas or make connections and collaborate differently or build community differently, that it's something that really crosses all of those areas. And so that's one of the great things about my work, is that I work with very diverse kinds of people who share an interest in how do they bring creativity to whatever it is they're doing.
So you have your set model or tools and you apply it for these different populations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's, I would say at the core of all of it is the idea of the creative thinking and problem-solving process as really reflecting our cognitive thinking ability to be creative and imaginative. And it's also the part where we get stuck when we are trying to do something different but don't know how to sort of proceed to solve something in a new and different way, or come up with a new approach to something. So it's helping people really be deliberate and intentional about applying this. So in some ways it's not that this is terribly complicated, but it's often that we don't do it either individually or in groups of people. Mm-hmm. So it's how to really help people learn to do that better. Mm-hmm. And it's something we all had as kids, of course, that we did well. And anytime you might watch a 5-year-old play or invent or make-believe, you know, it's something we all did and have the capacity to do, but we often kind of unlearn it in our educational experience of one right answer and one way of looking at something.
Yeah, well, it's a natural process. I mean, being creative is just by the fact that we're alive and born, but we get sort of, you're saying, socialized out of our natural inclination, our ability to tap into that.
Yeah, and of course it's something that happens sort of in many areas. It happens at home, it happens in school, it happens sort of in society in general, and as we're kids, and then when we get to be adults and we get in a workplace, and some of that gets reflected in the workplace as well. So for most of us, I mean, it's something that, again, it's still there, but we often don't have the opportunity to tap into that in the work that we do or in the learning that we do, and so it's something that we sort of have to be intentional about doing, at least initially, to almost practice it, just like we would practice a physical exercise. This is a mental exercise, and it's something we can practice, and the more we do, the better we get at it.
So tell me, I want to go down that road a little bit, but before we do that, tell me a little bit about your background. Like, how did you come to this work? Like, your educational background, your work background. This is very specialized niche. Yeah,
and I always say that my mom, I've been doing this almost 20 years, and my mom still doesn't really know what to tell people I do for a living.
He's a creative guy.
And my mentor who got me into this field is almost 100 years old, and her siblings she's been doing this about almost 50 years, and her siblings don't know what to say she does either. So her name is Bernice Bleedorn, and I took her class almost 20 years ago in Minnesota and as a sophomore, and it was called Entrepreneurial Creative Thinking and Problem Solving, and it had people really from all majors and backgrounds. And she ran a creativity center at the university, and I started working with her to promote public non-credit programs and workshops and conferences and stuff. And again, like I was saying with my work today, drawing people from all different backgrounds, the work we did at the university drew people out of business and education and the community and retired people and artists, and you know, I just really got hooked on it, and she, you know, it certainly encouraged my creativity, and as she did with pretty much all of her students, and she got into this field, again, I was in her 50s, almost 50 years ago, and she took a course from Paul Torrance, who was one of the early researchers in the field of creativity going back into the 50s and 60s, and really laid a lot of groundwork for creative education, but then by extension what we do with adults around creativity and creative thinking. So
she's still alive?
She's still alive. Next month I think she's going to be 99, if I've got the math right still.
Okay, well, creativity served her well, I guess.
Exactly. I mean, one of my great interests, as you know, is around creative aging, and I mean, she really is an example of that herself, and you know, on many levels, including, going back to school later in life and almost creating a whole new life in the whole second half of your life. And, a lot of people often don't get into that or ask those questions maybe until their 60s or 70s, and she did in her 50s, and kind of
Well,
by
she was
chance.
ahead of her time. I mean,
She
now it's a hot
was,
topic
yeah.
with the baby boomers
Yeah.
as they're retiring. What's their second act going to be?
Exactly. Yeah, and for me, I mean, that very much is a creative challenge, and so how to help people in that place in life to be able to use creativity and creative thinking to ask questions about what's purposeful and meaningful to me, and once I sort of explore what that is and make some connections, to have some practical tools to say, how do I implement that and make that real and live it out in the world.
Well, it's interesting because you and I were talking earlier about how people tend to dissociate purpose and creativity or making a living. Somehow they think that they can't all go together.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's, to me, it's such a core connection to what this is all about, because so many times I saw people come to workshops for professional reasons and to learn team building and problem solving, but they often tapped into something that was very personal and very purposeful that they either hadn't thought about in a long time or perhaps ever, and started having this sort of awakening of their creativity and their creative selves. And so for me, it was sort of this connection of creativity engages people in something meaningful, and sometimes that's learning, sometimes it's work, sometimes it's how they engage in their communities through volunteerism or whatever, but that creativity plays a role in linking us in an engaging way to something that's purposeful and meaningful.
So it sounds like you took this really interesting, engaging, creative course in college, and that got you hooked. I know you went to work for a number of nonprofits.
Several kinds of organizations. I worked. I actually worked for the university for a little bit, and then I spent a year helping a husband and wife toy inventor team launch a creativity consulting business. Once they realized they were creative, which I always think is such a great story, because the rest of us would say, who more creative than toy inventors? But initially, they didn't really perceive what they did as creative, because they sold ideas to toy companies. They didn't make anything. They didn't produce anything. They didn't draw anything. They weren't engineers.
They came up with ideas for toys.
Yeah, so in essence, they sold air. They sold the concept to a toy company. And once they sort of expanded their idea about what is creativity, when they were in one of our programs at the university at the time, and realized what they do every day is very creative. And not only that, but it's a great metaphor to help the rest of us understand what creative thinking is about, using the metaphors from toy invention to talk about creativity and creative thinking. So I helped them get that launched, and they actually now do that as their primary work, and I don't think do a lot of toy business stuff right now.
Interesting.
And then I ended up working in the corporate training conference business for a publishing company for a few years, and then ran a nonprofit focused on creativity and producing a conference. And
now you've had your own firm now for how long?
Well, off and on for a lot of years, and most recently as my primary work, I guess it's been about maybe 4 years. Okay. And again, just really working with all different groups, but particularly lately with a lot of schools and education and professional development around bringing creativity into the classroom, and particularly in light of a lot of emphasis around 21st century skills and creativity and collaboration and problem solving and critical thinking being top ideas of 21st century skills.
Well, hot topic, and goodness knows our educational system needs a major overhaul.
Yeah, and and there's a lot of people that are interested in it, and so to have some formal workshops and professional development and administrators who sort of get it and are willing to sort of begin to talk about this or do workshops around what is this and how do you bring it into the classroom is a good thing. And
so you do your workshops with the administrators and the teachers?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes together, sometimes separate. But certainly all of them have been in stuff that I've done, and that there's interest coming from all of them. And
do you ever do work with the students themselves?
I do, but not as much. And it's an area I do have interest in doing more of, and I may actually do some of that coming up in Danbury with some teachers that I've done work with, and so by extension to hopefully do some work with the students directly. And I think that's good too for the teachers, because sometimes when these concepts are new to them, and how do you integrate it into what you're already doing, so that you're not saying, well, this is today's flavor of the month, so put what you're already doing aside, but how do you actually incorporate it into what you're doing to do it differently, perhaps better, and bring new things into it, but without saying there's something wrong with that.
Yeah.
And so to model that with a group of students directly with the teacher at the same time instead of just doing it with a group of teachers, I think can definitely be a deeper experience.
Yeah, so you have a set of tools and processes that you teach people in terms of how they stimulate their creativity?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, sort of at the core is the creative process itself, and then there's some instruments that help people understand sort of the creative thinking styles and strengths, which is often a good starting point because it helps people both understand their own creativity strengths, but then also how does it relate to other people, and particularly if you work in a team. So say in a corporate setting where you're probably doing much more collaborative stuff every day than you might be in a school setting. Some schools probably do more than others, but certainly in a corporate environment, there's almost nothing you do alone. So how does your particular set of creative strengths fit in with other people's, and recognizing that all of that is part of the creative process, not just sort of some of the traditionally stereotypical parts of being great at coming up with ideas, but that's part of it, along with seeing new opportunities and problems to solve and areas to pursue, and being evaluative, and also how do you implement this stuff, because sometimes people who are great at coming up with all the ideas aren't great at picking and implementing.
Yep.
And so how do you bring those pieces together, recognizing it's all part of the creative process?
So I'm curious, because I do, as you know, a lot of work in the corporate arena and a lot with teams, et cetera. And so the assessment, the creativity or creative thinking assessment that you use, how different is that from a lot of the other assessments out there, like a Myers-Briggs, or, I mean, is this a proprietary assessment instrument that you created, or one that you've tapped into? Or?
I didn't create it. It was created by actually somebody who had an engineering background and worked in a company, and then kind of got hooked on this himself and ended up starting his own center and then teaching in a business school up in Canada. And he really was an advocate of the creative process, and so really based this on sort of some assumptions about what styles would fit with what parts of the process. So what I like about this is that because I'm using both of those anyways, they really go together in a very direct way, and people can sort of understand those links, where other assessments sometimes takes more explaining to link the assessment to the process and build the connections that are there. And, you know, so there is some overlap. I know, like, for instance, with Myers-Briggs, where the person who developed this actually has done some sort of comparing directly of those two instruments. And, you know, there's some links in some areas, but not in others. Like, I think it's true with a lot of assessments that some overlap, but some differences too.
Yeah.
And actually using sometimes more than one assessment can help people understand that that label doesn't mean the be-all and end-all of who you are, but that just because you're the same on this one doesn't mean you're going to be the same on the next one.
Well, as with any model,
Yeah.
I mean, the benefit is it gives people a shorthand and a common language, but you want to make sure, people don't get stuck with a label and it's limiting, because people are really complex.
And sometimes people do latch on because it's so new to them and they find it so interesting. They're like, oh, well, now I know who I am and what I should do or who I should be. And it's like, it's a part of it. And it might change a little bit down the road. So don't.
Right. Especially if you're talking about creativity.
Exactly.
Right? You want it to be evolving, right? So do you just focus in on creative thinking versus other aspects of creativity? Like, how do you define creativity?
I guess at the core, I look at being able to think in new ways and see in new ways. And so the thinking part, I would say, again, is sort of a base to all of it. But I do other sort of engagement, experiential activities that relate to trying to understand this better. And I also will collaborate with people who do very experiential stuff that might be in the arts or might be in performance or improv or whatever. One of the organizations that I've been talking with a lot, and we haven't collaborated in the workshop sense, but in some conference settings where we're talking about some of these ideas, is the dance company Pilopolis here in Connecticut, which as an organization operates very creatively. I mean, their whole idea is about creative collaboration and how they take the creative process of what they do in the studio to develop a new dance or performance to actually run the organization as a creative organization. And so to me, it's, first of all, such a great example of an organization trying to really implement what it means to be a creative organization and struggle with that.
What would be an example of they're operating creatively that other organizations might not do?
Well, sometimes they use the phrase radical democracy to talk about that you know, many voices matter in the process. So, for instance, they don't have just one artistic director like a lot of arts organizations do. They have 2 or 3 or 4 artistic directors at a time. And it isn't even that they all have the final say, that the dancers and performers also often contribute ideas into what it should look like or how it should function. And so...
Does that get confusing or complex and messy?
I'm sure it does.
Too many cooks in the kitchen?
Yeah, but not necessarily in a bad way. I think it's yes, it's messy, but it isn't a bad thing. You know, it's like, and I think that's part of this. I mean, to be hierarchical and more controlling, whether it's in a classroom or a workplace or a family or whatever, is easier. But it's probably not as rich or as engaging or as participatory as it would be if you are more collaborative about it and more equal about it. So, you know, I think their experience of what they're doing in an organizational setting, you know, is applicable to think about in a school setting of what does it look like if you run a classroom like that. I mean, I attempt to do that in the class that I teach at UConn, the creativity and social change, that the students actually drive a lot of the content. So more than half of my syllabus at the beginning of the semester is blank, that they help choose topics and they help actually lead each week in class. Some of the readings and the guests or content that we do and explore. And so for the first 2 or 3 or 4 weeks of class, it's much messier than your typical class and cumbersome and chaotic. But hopefully at the end of the semester, it's a better experience for them because they've played a role in helping actually create and shape
more ownership.
what's happening.
It sounds like the medium is the message, if
Yeah.
you will. I mean,
Yeah.
if you had a course on creativity and collaboration and they weren't collaborating with it, it kind of would be
Exactly.
defeating the purpose,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Now that's interesting. Yeah, I was going to ask you about that because I went on your website and it's part of the UConn's Creative Community Building Program. So what is all that about?
Yeah,
Sounds interesting.
the focus is around creative community building, and the formal program that it's part of is actually, the class is offered as part of the Bachelor of General Studies program, which is offered by the Center for Continuing Studies, and the Bachelor of General Studies is sort of focused on returning students who maybe have a 2-year degree or they started college and didn't finish and now they're coming back. And so within the Bachelor of General Studies, you can pick a theme, which is kind of like a major, but not, you don't have to take as many classes because it's deliberate. The General Studies is to let you take a lot of things you're interested in, so it's General Studies. So, but some people do have an interest in a particular area, so they're called themes, and the one that my class is a part of is public and community engagement. And it was a group of people that came together of community practitioners like myself, as well as some UConn faculty, around a community partnership program, I think it was called, to link UConn community internally as well as link the university and the community in both directions. And so we were interested in the idea of creative collaboration and cooperative development, so looking at cooperatives as an alternative to for-profit or non-profit. How do you engage in sort of democratic processes in communities and organizations to engage people, sort of like we were just talking about with Palabolas as one example. So it was a really interesting group of people that had backgrounds in philosophy and sociology and women's studies and cooperative development and education, and again, people in the community that were doing work around conflict resolution and nonviolence, and my work in creativity. So we've developed, I think now 3 or 4 new classes, including an online course in cooperative development, and anybody in other programs can take the classes too, but it's sort of geared at the people that are in the Bachelor of General Studies program.
Sounds really interesting.
So I've been teaching in Hartford thus far, and then this coming semester in the spring I'll actually be at the Waterbury campus. And one of the things that your audience might be interested in is that for adults who are 62 and older, UConn actually has a policy in general that you can audit a class for basically free. I think you pay a basically paperwork fee of $15 or $20 to just sign up for it, but in essence it's free. And given the nature of our classes that are geared at this public and community engagement, it's actually great to have that kind of participation
So you really have people of all ages in your class?
Yeah, and we don't always have the auditors there. We did the first time we offered it in stores, which was great. We had 3 people from the Willimantic community at the store's campus, and it was really, really good because they were people who were very active in community engagement projects already in the class with the students who were in their 20s and 30s.
And really talking about their life experience, and I bet that they were even more motivated in doing their homework. That's why I always heard people audit are more invested sometimes.
Even though they technically don't have to do it, but you know, sometimes they're just so interested in it. So, and a lot of people don't know that UConn, that's true for all of UConn's courses, but I mean, in these particular classes, you know, it'd be great. So if anybody in this area has an interest in the Spring and the Waterbury campus, it's something that they could contact UConn about.
So that's interesting. I was actually going to ask you for any other either low or no cost public forums for bringing creative people or people who want to be more creative together.
Sure. Yeah, one of the programs that I do on a monthly basis is called Creativity Networking, and it's hosted at the Silo at Hunt Hill Farm in New Milford. And it's always held on one Sunday per month for 90 minutes. And I often describe it as creativity and fill in the blank. And the blank is some guest who's doing something related to creativity, and it could be about food, it could be about spirituality, it could be about education, art. Yesterday we actually did one with a guest who teaches at UConn. He's actually a classics professor of, you know, Greek and ancient literature, but applying that to how are the video games and virtual worlds today sort of like what the written word was and books were back then, when we moved from the bards telling an oral story and improvising how they told that story to then we had a written books to now we have online, and is it sort of
virtual
the modern
reality.
day equivalent of what literature did to, you know,
shape
society and culture, the way we tell stories. And today, for young people, their primary way of hearing stories often is online videos, virtual worlds. So,
well, it's definitely rewiring their brains. There's a lot of research coming out on that now.
Yeah. So, you know, his work, just making these links, I think, was a creative process, but how creativity is being used in these settings, I think, was quite fascinating. So, we'll actually take a break in December, and then we'll pick it up again in January. And,
interesting. And I know you're doing something at the New Haven Festival?
Yeah, we're actually in conversations right now to add a new element to the Arts and Ideas Festival, which will be in June in New Haven. I think it runs 10 days or 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And to actually embed a creativity component across the festival in some shape or form. We're still trying to figure out what that will look like exactly, but we think we will have some in-depth, intensive, maybe workshop formats, which will sort of be a new component, because right now it's primarily performance-based and sort of ideas lecture-based. So this would sort of be in between that.
You know, it's interesting, because early in my career, I was originally trained as an art therapist, expressive arts therapist. And so I remember then, and even now in my current role, when you talk about creativity or whatever, people have definite, strong reactions to it. One way or the other, they either say, yeah, I'm a very creative person, or they say, I'm not creative. I mean, what? Of course, everybody's creative, but some people say, I am absolutely not creative. I don't have a creative bone in my body. What's your reaction to that? How do you deal with that when people say that?
I basically say I disagree with that, with their assessment of themselves, not your comment.
You are too.
And I truly, I mean, because for a lot of people, like you said, their definitions about creativity have to do with the arts. And if they say, I don't draw, I don't paint, I don't write, therefore I'm not creative, you're not talking about me.
I'm not an artist, with a capital A.
Yeah, and so thinking about how I often try to clarify then is to say, that's the creative arts, but there's a lot of other things too. And so in a workshop setting, I often will start by having a conversation with the audience about what is creativity, and we might even spend an hour or more on that conversation, because it really helps push open.
There's so many ways to define it. So just give us some headlines on how you define it.
Well, so people will often share, and I share these thoughts that, you know, ideas about openness and adaptability, and, you know, the idea of thinking out of the box. And
that's an overused term.
It is, and I often don't use it, but people will often share that as one of their defdefinitions, because that's what they think
it's like a rote response now, and what does that really mean? Everybody uses it today.
I actually, several years ago, heard an interview with Sting where he was talking about one of his new albums that had come out at the time, and it was sort of hard to categorize, and he said, I don't like to to ghettoize my music, and it just struck me like that's such a richer metaphor than thinking out of the box. If you say thinking out of the ghetto, and I know that can also raise other negative connotations,
yeah.
but what I like about it is so many people's initial thoughts about ghetto are all negative, but if you start to have a conversation about a ghetto or what's happening in a ghetto, you'll often get into the fact that there are positive things, or some of your work about resilience, that people can be very resilient in those settings, and to realize that everything about it is not necessarily negative.
Yeah.
And so, you know, to think beyond it might be to say to grow or to improve or to change, but all of that can open up a conversation about what does it mean to think differently? What does it mean to find negative and positive in any constrained situation, whether it's a box or an organization or a ghetto or...
What's your greatest hope with this work?
I think to engage people in a better quality of life, because they're tapping into their creativity and applying it to some aspect of their life. And so whether it's a young person in a school setting, whether it's an adult in a workplace setting, whether it's a retiree engaging in community in a new way, whether it's an artist doing something differently, but the strand across that is that if you do those things, that you discover your creativity and apply it to something that matters to you, that I think your life is better. I mean,
so if you had one suggestion to give somebody who wanted to foster a little bit more creativity, 5%, 10% in their lives, what could they do?
I guess a couple things I would say. One is to try new things, and even everyday mundane things like when I worked with the toy inventors, I remember one of the things that either he read or he just sort of thought about was, you know, wear your watch on a different wrist. Just kind of as a reminder that yes, it's uncomfortable, but you can live with it. You know, it's different, but it's totally doable. Or, you know, take a new route, or eat something differently than you might. I mean, like if you're eating an orange or an apple, like pay attention to it. And this whole idea of being aware and present, sort of that comes out of meditation and yoga and other things. I mean, the idea of being present in the moment, that heightens your awareness, and when your awareness is heightened, that you might make new connections differently. And I think the other part is get the judgment out of the way. That
That's a big one.
being creative.
Boy, we could have a whole other show on that. That's a huge one. If people are interested in talking to you more, finding out more about your work, where might they contact you?
My website is appliedimagination.org, and I'm based out of New Milford.
Okay, great. Steve, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you very much.
Until next time, I'm Susan Shaner with Community Forum. Thanks for joining us.